This podcast is brought to you by HEC Paris.
Messieurs les présidents, chers collègues professeurs, chers étudiants, chers amis, mesdames, messieurs, vous ne m'en voudrez pas si, au début de cette manifestation importante pour le groupe HEC, je vous présente la carrière du professeur Michael Porter et si je vous la présente en anglais de façon à honorer notre hôte. We are all here today at this prestigious event to celebrate a colleague who, through his distinguished career, has embodied these high standards. It's my honor to introduce Michael Porter to you, after which he will deliver his vision of economic prosperity and innovation in developed countries, a theme which is of fundamental importance to our school. It's both a great honor and a unique opportunity to welcome Professor Michael Porter among us. I would like to point out that for a number of reasons, the man and his work are well known to many of us on this campus, and the main reasons for that are the following ones. All members of the faculty and nearly all the students have already read and studied your writings. Professor Porter has established professional and personal relations with a number of our faculty, and especially Bertrand Moinjon, with the head of HEC Executive Development Center, and to whom I would like to express my thanks for organizing this conference. And finally, we have been working with several colleagues from Harvard Business School, and especially with Chris Honoris. I think it's fair to say to you, Michael Porter, that apparently you appreciate HEC, and for that conviction, I would like to thank you very much. It's a great honor to welcome you this afternoon, because your presence this afternoon inspired for us what we are pursuing in this institution. First, academic excellence and a concern for rigorous professional discipline, which are the demands imposed by a noble spirit. Second, a passion for knowledge and the encouragement of creativity, which is the vocation of all outstanding institutions of higher learning. And third, a natural talent for conviviality, I would even say for friendship, which is an essential, often underestimated stimulus transmitting the values represented in the pursuit of knowledge. We are now all eager to hear what you have to say about one of your current subjects of research, innovation and prosperity of advanced nations. At a time when, propelled by the exponential development of technology and the globalization of the economy, history seems to accelerate, our forecasts for the future are overtaken by reality, and the business companies we serve are clamoring for new concepts and new strategies. It's thus with the greatest attention and the utmost pleasure that I will now turn over the floor to Professor Michael Porter. Thank you, Michael.
Well, first of all, I want to say how honored and delighted I am to be here at HEC today. This is one of the great management schools of the world, and I've never had the And I've never really had the privilege of being here, although I've known and worked with a number of your faculty. It's really, it means a lot to somebody like me who spends an awful lot of time kind of buried in the library thinking and writing, to actually see that the work is having an impact, and that it's not only influencing practice, which I participate in personally given my other activities, but also it's impacting the development of theory in the various disciplines in which I work. As you all know, I work in really two broad areas that are very tightly interconnected. The first is, of course, my roots, which is strategy for companies. And what I tried to do is bring kind of a new rigor to the question of how to think about strategy, how to develop strategy, using economic theory, but using it in a way that tries to capture the richness and the complexity of actual competition, rather than assume it all away. I also work in the area of competitiveness of nations, states, and cities, and I see these things as very closely interconnected, because, of course, prosperity ultimately is created by firms who are able to create products and services that are valued in the market. But we know increasingly that firms can't be competitive unless they're in the right kind of business environment. And that raises very important issues for both business and government in thinking about how to create that environment in nations and states, and increasingly in smaller geographic areas. There's so much about what I'm working on right now that I'd like to talk about today, but I've been limited to, I don't have a whole day. I only have about 20 or 25 minutes. And so what I'd like to do is talk about one recent body of research that I've been working on, really working on as we speak, on the fundamental bases for innovation in advanced economies. And let me see if I can set the stage a little bit to talk about this topic. And perhaps I can share with you some of what we're learning about this question, and then we can maybe have a little bit of time later on for discussion. Now, I think there's been now a great deal of attention and research on the area of competitiveness, what makes nations prosperous, and we've learned a lot. I think we've learned that competitiveness is fundamentally determined not by macroeconomic policy, but by microeconomic policy. That the macroeconomic environment, the exchange rates, the government budget, the interest rates, set an environment that can help competitiveness or retard competitiveness, but the fundamental basis of prosperity is not the macroeconomics. It's actually the behavior of individual firms and markets. And so increasingly, I think around the world, we're recognizing that we have to go beyond macroeconomic policy. We have to go beyond having a stable and sound macroeconomic policy. We have to think systematically about how to create a microeconomic environment in which companies can prosper, in which companies can produce better and better products more and more efficiently. As we've looked at microeconomics of competitiveness, we've come to see that the fundamental basis for competitiveness is indeed productivity. It's productivity that makes a nation prosperous, the ability to produce a lot of valuable output for every day of work, for every franc of capital invested. If you're productive, you can pay yourself a lot, you can support high wages, you can support high returns to capital. If you're not productive, none of those things can happen, and you're destined to be less prosperous. And we know increasingly that productivity is fundamentally the job of companies, but it's also the job of government to create the right environment in which companies can operate productively because they have the right infrastructure, because they can draw on the right kind of inputs, and so on. As we've looked at the kind of developments around the world in competitiveness over the last 5 or 10 years, I think what we're seeing now is that the agenda is beginning to shift. Really, the first stage of the competitiveness movement in countries around the world was really focused on what I might call short-term competitiveness, improving efficiencies, eliminating waste, improving quality, improving time to market on the company side. On the government side, governments have been taking great steps around the world to kind of get the house in order, to improve the quality of the infrastructure, to improve education systems, to make the regulatory environment less restrictive, to allow companies more flexibility and freedom to compete, to open up competition so that the competitive forces can pressure firms to keep improving, to be more efficient, to be more effective. So I think I would characterize really the last 10 years as the era of getting the house in order. What we discovered, particularly when Japanese companies came into Western markets, was that we had a lot of work to do to get our houses in order, to simply operate businesses and countries efficiently in order to be productive, in order to avoid waste, in order to avoid defects. But I think it's starting to be clear that that's no longer going to be the really defining agenda for future competitiveness in many countries. That's not to say that this agenda is finished. I would dare say, with all respect, that France has a long way to go. There's a lot that needs to be done to improve the microeconomic environment so that French companies can be more productive, so that they can produce more valuable products, so they can produce them more efficiently, so that they can use their capital better. And I know that there's a great dialogue and debate within this country about just how to do that and how to make the difficult choices between social and economic policy that are the traditional formulation. If I had more time, I'd talk about how I think the whole idea that social policy and economic policy are different is a complete mistake. And that really what we have to learn to do is to integrate them and to see that they're actually not incompatible at all, as long as we think about them as a whole rather than as separate parts. But let's assume that many nations are doing great things to try to improve their basic efficiency and productivity today. And companies are doing that as well. The next real agenda I see facing many companies around the world and countries around the world is really the agenda of innovation. I think it's no longer going to be enough, certainly for advanced nations, simply to just be more efficient at doing what they're already doing. Indeed, I would say that advanced nations cannot be prosperous producing standard products using standard processes. If it's a standard product using a standard process, the developing countries are going to win. They have improving skills, improving infrastructure. Technology diffuses very rapidly. There's no way that firms based in France or the United States are going to be successful in the future producing basic standard products, the same products that were produced in the past, using the same processes. Indeed, I believe that there's no hope for advanced countries to improve their prosperity and probably even to sustain their prosperity unless they can be very innovative, unless they can produce the new products, the products that don't exist today, and produce them fast enough so that they can move forward as fast as the developing nations can catch up as technology diffuses. We know that technology is spreading around the world very rapidly. It only takes a few years for the Korean firm or the Thailand firm to be able to make the product that you used to be the only one who could make today. This process of globalization and the improvement of the capabilities of the developing world, I think, raises the stakes in advanced countries like France and like the United States for innovation. Without innovation, we simply will not be able to support high wages. The kind of cruel reality of the global economy is that you can only pay yourself what you earn. You can't close yourself off anymore from other countries and live in your own little world. If you can't do something much more productively and much more innovatively than somebody else in some other location, then the wages are not going to be sustainable. So I think, although the kind of last agenda of competitiveness was kind of how to improve near-term efficiency and productivity, really the long-term challenge is how to move one step back and create the innovative capacity which will allow companies to move forward very rapidly with products and processes and stay ahead of the process of diffusion and open up room for developing countries to compete, but without taking away the prosperity of the Western nations. I would also say that all the advanced nations, without exception, are facing the same challenge, and that is the challenge of a slow growth workforce. In the past, one of the reasons that in the United States we've been able to have a pretty good rate of economic growth lately is because we've had quite a few workers entering the workforce. Part of that was because of simply population growth. Later, it was because women really moved into the workforce in large numbers. That sustained the economic growth of the U.S. In part over the last 10 or 20 years, in addition to improving the productivity of capital, which has been a big part of our economic growth. But increasingly, the productivity of capital is already probably too high. We have extraordinarily high rates of return on capital being earned in the American economy right now that are probably unhealthy for sustained economic growth. There needs to be a higher rate of investment. Moreover, we know that the population is not going to grow. Indeed, we'll be very lucky in the United States if our workforce grows at 1% per year. Lucky. And the same is true in France, and the same is true in Japan. Indeed, some countries are facing a declining workforce. How will we sustain our prosperity in a world where there's a slow-growing workforce? There's only one way, and that's innovation. We have to make substantial leaps forward in productivity. And those leaps have to be throughout the economy, not just in one or two sectors that we focus on, in order to sustain healthy economic growth. So I believe that really the next competitiveness challenge facing particularly the advanced nations is the challenge of innovation. How can nations create the right environment to support a sustained rate of innovation over long periods of time at the world frontier of technology? And as we started to sense this agenda, we started a process of research to try to really understand the bases for innovative success at the national level, but do it in a little bit different way than has been done in the past. Most of the research on innovation in different countries has been qualitative. It's been based on very rich stories about individual nations and how their innovation process works. There's been no really systematic, rigorous comparison of innovative behavior across a large sample of countries for a variety of reasons. And what we set out to do was see if we could come up with a quantifiable, rigorous methodology for really looking at a nation's innovative capacity in a persuasive way to guide the process of setting priorities and policies for the future. Now, in order to do that, we need a theoretical framework, and of course, my favorite theoretical framework for looking at anything about nations is the diamond. The idea is that in looking at the environment for competition in a location, in a nation, there are four fundamental influences on the business environment: the quality of the inputs, the labor, the infrastructure, the capital, the technical base, the sophistication of the customer and the demand, important in driving innovation and improving quality, the vitality of the rivalry and the competition that's occurring in the location, and the presence of what I call clusters, or groups of interlinked industries across which there are externalities and spillovers that stimulate and improve productivity. This general framework can be applied to thinking about the environment for innovation. And what I've shaded here are some of the particular influences on the capacity of nations to innovate that I think are quite clear from looking at the body of literature in this area. It's clear that to innovate we need the right kind of human resources, particularly human resources that are scientifically or technically trained. We need the right kind of capital pool. We need good, strong, basic research infrastructure. We need to protect intellectual property to create incentives for innovation. We need to encourage the sophistication of our customer base and the demands we place on firms to improve their standards through regulation, and so on. Now, the challenge we had was to try to take this general framework and really apply it to thinking quantitatively about innovative activity across countries. And what we did to do that was we kind of simplified the world just a little bit into the following framework. Basically, what we have argued, and this, by the way, is work that I've done largely with Professor Scott Stern at MIT and the National Bureau of Economic Research, is kind of characterize the bases of innovation at the national level as consisting of three broad areas. One is what we call the common innovation infrastructure. These are policies and investments that create the potential for innovation or the incentives for innovation throughout the entire economy. A good example here would be protecting intellectual property. If you have good intellectual property laws, that benefits a firm in any industry. That creates greater incentive to innovate. Another example over here would be having a large supply of scientists and engineers graduating every year from universities, and a very sophisticated managerial cadre graduating from, of course, HEC, number one. So there's some common infrastructure items that are important. Many of you probably are aware of the literature on so-called national innovation systems. There's a large literature on national innovation systems, and that literature is principally concerned with this kind of common infrastructure, common institutions and processes that work within countries to stimulate innovation really across the board. The other part of the innovation environment is the innovation environments in particular industry clusters within the economy. Now, what's a cluster? A cluster is an agglomeration or a combination of firms in a given field, often in a very narrow geographic location. HEC is actually part of a cluster. It's around you. There are other educational institutions here. There are research institutions here. There are research-intensive companies located here. That's a cluster. This is an example from the oil and gas cluster concentrated in Houston. Houston Texas no longer produces very much oil. But Houston, Texas is the place where virtually all of the major innovations in oil and gas discovery and production and development have taken place over the last 20 years. That's because there's a cluster. All these institutions and suppliers and subcontractors and service providers and specialized geology departments, all these things are kind of co-located in the greater Houston area. And there's this enormous process of information exchange and jealousy and rivalry and competition which drives these institutions to look for new ideas and to carry those ideas out and to put them into practice very rapidly. We know that the cluster then is a very important locus of innovation. We know that the cluster is the better way of looking at it than looking at an individual firm or industry, because some of the most important drivers of the innovation process have to do with the linkages across industries, the ability to relate to suppliers or firms in related fields. Where you have those kind of connections and linkages across firms, you see the greatest rate of innovation. So part of the innovation environment in any country is really the environments in all the clusters in that country. So if we look at France, that would be in kind of fashion, goods, and power generation and transmission, and a variety of other areas in which France has an established critical mass of success. And the health of the innovation environment in those particular clusters becomes really the second key part of the innovation environment of the nation. And then the third piece of the equation is really the connections between the two. The mechanisms that connect the generic, general scientific base with the specific application, if you will, in the industrial clusters. What are some of the most powerful mechanisms we have? Well, the venture capital community is one such mechanism. The venture capital community is a bridge between the basic ideas and commercialization. The university system is a very fundamental mechanism for connecting basic science and commercial applications. Those are just two examples of these linkage mechanisms. What we set out to do then is to try to create measures of these that were robust across a large sample of advanced nations. Now, what we found was that we could measure the common innovation infrastructure pretty well. It's pretty easy to get data on things like how much the country spends on R&D, how much is spent on higher education, and so on. You see the kind of variables that we looked at in that regard. It's much harder to come up with measures that are consistent across countries that capture the innovation environment in the clusters, because, of course, every country has a different mix of clusters. Here, and in the area of linkages, we were forced to use kind of indirect measures. And the measures we chose were, in the case of cluster-specific conditions, the percentage of national R&D actually funded by the private sector. The idea here was that if the R&D budget of the nation was funded by the private sector, that is a pretty good sign that the environment for innovation in the immediate cluster of the firm is a healthy one. So that was kind of an indirect indication of that cluster-specific innovation environment. In terms of the quality of linkages, we focused on the universities as really a crucial linkage mechanism between basic knowledge and science and commercialization. And what we focused on then is the percentage of national R&D actually performed by universities. It could be funded by government or business, but if it was performed in the university, that created a particularly attractive setting for the exchange and diffusion of ideas and technology back and forth. We find that universities are really the most powerful mechanism known to man to both create and diffuse knowledge, because the university is a very open setting. The university combines the training of bright young people with the creation of knowledge. Those young people take the knowledge out with them. They start companies. The university setting then becomes a very powerful linkage mechanism. And we were focusing then on what percentage of the R&D in a country actually takes place in the university system versus government laboratories or purely in the private sector as two alternatives. And what we did was we took these measures and we modeled them using a measure of innovative output, which was international patenting. Now, for those of you that are science and technology policy buffs, you all know that there is no perfect measure of innovative output. Patents don't cover all innovations. Some innovations, many innovations are not patented. They're protected by trade secrets. Some are copyrighted. The truth is, unfortunately, though, that there's no other measure that's consistent. Copyright data is worthless and not very interesting in revealing anything about the differences across countries because it's inconsistent and incompatible. So basically what we believe is that the international patent provides the best, most rigorous approach to measuring international innovative output. And we chose international patents to tighten that linkage even more. What's an international patent? An international patent is a patent that's filed in France, but also filed in the United States. Or filed in Britain, but also filed in the United States. So for a foreign-based invention, it had to be patented in the home country, but also in the United States. For a U.S. innovation or invention, it had to be patented in the United States, but also in at least one other foreign country. And what this allowed us to do was focus on that set of patents that was likely to be commercially significant. Because nobody's going to go to the trouble of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to file a patent in the U.S. Patent Office or in some foreign patent office as a U.S. company unless there's some commercial significance to the innovation. So this allowed us to home in on that subset of innovations measured by patents that were likely to be important ones, and to kind of use that as a proxy for overall innovative output, under the assumption that the patenting rate is correlated with the broader array of innovative activities going on in the economy. We also, by using the U.S. Patent Office as kind of a condition for being listed or being measured, we put all the patents on a constant, consistent basis in terms of their scientific and technical achievement. And since the U.S. is such a kind of innovative country, we were pretty sure that if something got approved by the U.S. Patent Office, that it was a kind of best-in-the-world type technology, not just kind of an imitation that's not as good. And what we did was we looked at the international patenting of all the OECD countries, the 17 OECD countries, over the last 20 to 25 years. And then we also looked at some emerging countries for a shorter period of time because of lack of longer-term data. And we built a model to try to find out which of those measures of national innovative capacity actually explained, statistically, the patenting rates of the various nations, expressing patenting on a per capita basis. Again, it's not very meaningful to look at absolute numbers of patents. You've got to scale that by some measure that gets at the intensity of innovation given the size of the economy. And so the measure we chose was per capita international patenting. And we did a kind of large kind of panel regression analysis. And let me show you, give you some of the results of what we found. First of all, we found that those measures that I had on the earlier slide, those measures of policy commitments and resource commitments to innovative capacity accounted for 99% of all the variation across countries and time in international patenting per capita. This is really, I think, a striking finding. We believe for a long time that it's very hard to measure innovation. It's very idiosyncratic. It's unmeasurable almost. But what we were able to find is if you take some very sensible variables that have to do with a nation's commitment to innovative capacity, those variables explain a lot of the output. And I think that's comforting. It tells us that we have some basic understanding of the phenomenon. Second finding was no single factor explained very much. You needed all of those factors to explain the 99%. What that says is that you can't just double your R&D budget at the nation. That won't work unless you also improve your intellectual property protection, your pool of science and technology personnel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Innovation is really is truly a system. And you have to put all the pieces in place if you're going to support a robust rate of innovation. We found that scientific output, as measured by journal articles, regrettably, doesn't explain very much. Getting published and having commercially significant innovations are very different things. There's a correlation between the two. There is a relationship, but it's not a particularly strong relationship. And indeed, what we find is that some countries are pretty good at getting published, like the UK, but pretty bad at converting those publications into commercially significant innovations. Other countries, like the United States, are actually pretty good at both. And that's obviously where you want to be. So science is not enough. You need the science, but you also need the broader, more supportive environment with the right incentives in place to support the innovative activity. We found that how the nation's R&D is actually funded and performed makes a big difference. We found that higher percentages of R&D funded by business is very, very powerful impact on the productivity of innovative spending. You want a lot of your R&D actually funded by business, and you want to create incentives so that business is incented to fund a lot of the R&D, because that tends to hook and ground the R&D in the commercial process. Whereas if the nation is depending heavily on government for funding the national R&D budget, you kind of lose that tight connection with commercialization. In terms of performing R&D, we found very strong results. We found that performing more in the university is much more productive than performing it in government laboratories. Indeed, we found that if you perform too much in government laboratories, more than a little, that actually detracts from the nation's innovation productivity rate. So that we've learned there's some things here coming out of this that have to do with how you structure the R&D enterprise and what institutions you use to conduct the various parts of the R&D process. We found that if you control for all these other things, maintaining the status quo, that is having a constant rate of R&D investment, a constant pool of R&D workers, produces diminishing returns. What this says is that it's getting harder to come up with best-in-the-world technologies. You're having to put more resources and stronger policy commitments to bear to keep boosting the rate of innovation. If a nation stays still, keeps the same R&D spending rate, keeps the same scientific and technology workforce percentage, it actually falls behind. Its rate of output of innovation actually slows down. Why would that be true? Because of the nature of the economy we're in. We're in an economy that's increasingly defined by kind of knowledge and creativity and innovation, and the complexity is growing, and so you've got to put more resources into innovative and knowledge-creating activity if you're going to have the appropriate output. And we also were able to verify that if you are successful in generating a steady stream of new-to-the-world technologies in the form of international patents, that is very tightly correlated to world market share in technology-based industries. In fact, there's about an 80% correlation. So we were able to demonstrate that international patenting isn't just an interesting measure from a scholarly point of view, it's also a very interesting measure in the marketplace. It's highly correlated with outcomes that are very important to nations in terms of their export base. So these are some of the general findings. Now, we then did another kind of exercise, which was the creation of what we call the Innovation Index. And here what we were trying to do was measure the underlying potential of a nation to be innovative based on the kind of findings from this modeling exercise. Essentially what we did was we estimated the model that I just talked about, the panel regression across all the OECD countries, and then we took the coefficients from that equation and then applied the actual resource and policy commitments of the nation and used that to calculate an index. So essentially what the coefficients do is allow you to weight the various things. You know, how important is overall R&D spending versus intellectual property protection versus something else. So we used the weights from the regression to weight the variables in the country's own record to roll up an innovation index. And this is going to be a little hard for many of you to see, but this is kind of some of the findings. First thing we did was we kind of looked backwards and said, okay, if we look over time at the country's actual spending on R&D, actual science and technology personnel, et cetera, and we apply the weights, what is kind of an index of the innovative potential of that country? And what we find here is back in the early 70s, there was really two countries that were way, way above everybody else, the US and Switzerland. Now remember, we're talking about per capita innovation. And that's what's relevant for per capita income. And Switzerland, indeed, was a very prosperous nation, partly because it was very innovative. There's a lot of scientific and technical output per Swiss. The US also was quite innovative. Then we had a whole bunch of other nations kind of bunched down at a lower level, maybe a second tier, and France is the red line. France was one of those. What happened over the course of the 70s and 80s and into the first part of the 90s was that some nations moved up into the top tier. Japan is the most conspicuous example. Japan starts here, and it's had a little bit of a hiccup lately, but it's up there in the top tier. Germany worked its way up into the top tier. Germany is this blue line here. Sweden worked its way up into the top tier. France and the UK didn't work their way up quite as far. The UK actually is the more troubling trajectory. Basically, the UK's innovative capacity, measured the way we measured, is basically the same as it was 20 years ago. And what we know is that that's going to produce a declining rate of innovative output. France made kind of a bit of a spurt at the end. But I think we should view this data with some concern from France, and we should view it with even greater concern for the U.S. Because look at what happened. The U.S., after a great surge of investment and policy improvements to support innovation during the kind of late 60s up into the end of the 80s, has kind of been declining. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If you change this into rankings, this chart might be easier to read. What we see is that the real success stories over the last 20 years or so, and this doesn't look at the whole period back to 73, this starts in 1980, we see that the Scandinavian countries have really moved up in the innovative rankings. And I think the real success happening in Scandinavia right now is no accident. The enormous success of Finland is no accident. Finland systematically boosted their innovative capacity through their university system, through their R&D budget, through a lot of the policies that they put in place. Australia is moving up. Japan hasn't gone very far since 1980. The UK actually lost a fair number of places. Canada has lost. Germany has been affected by unification. Without the unification, Germany would have held their own pretty well since 1980. France, kind of a little bit of a slide. Now, if we take the same methodology, but kind of scroll the clock forward, here's what we come up with. What we did here was we assumed that the policy trajectory of the nation was essentially projected from the last 3 years of the period that we studied. So in the case of France, let's assume that France's R&D budget growth and scientific and technical manpower growth is kind of the same as it was the last 3 years of the earlier model. Let's project that out 15 years in the future, and let's do that for each country. Where would we be in 10 or 15 years? That was the process we went through. This is not a forecast. It is a projection. It simply takes the current momentum and projects it out into the future. And what you see is that, again, the Scandinavian countries are really on a positive track. They are making choices to boost innovative capacity. France is kind of treading water. Look at who's on the bottom. Now, this whole project started because a number of high-tech CEOs in the United States kind of started talking, and they discovered that they all had a deep concern about the future of innovation in science and technology in the United States. This may seem like an incredible thing for you who are not deeply embedded in the American system right now. It seems like right now in the United States we are on the top of our game in innovation. But as we looked at the data, and this was something intuitively that the high-tech CEOs knew, there was something very, very distressing going on. And basically what that was that the U.S., after a kind of a surge in the Reagan administration, where all the key drivers of innovative capacity were on the way up, the U.S. has been in a period where we're actually cutting back today on the things that over the next 15 or 20 years will create the foundation for the next round of innovation. R&D expenditures, particularly basic R&D, have been declining. The crisis we have in the United States, and I think it's truly a crisis, is really here. There's actually fewer engineers graduating in the U.S. today than in the past. In a growing economy where the knowledge intensity is going up, that's not a very favorable trend at all. And part of the reason there's fewer engineers graduating is that we are both underinvesting as well as not doing a very good job with the money we do spend on our higher education system. And so we find that too many of our young people, once they get to college, they won't even try engineering. They won't even attempt it. They won't try biology or chemistry because they're pretty sure they won't be able to hack it, because they don't have the foundation training in math and science and kind of disciplined thinking from their younger years. This particular problem France does not have, and it's one of the great blessings that you have going for you. If you look at some of the data on the kind of R&D personnel in the U.S. economy, this kind of gives you a flavor for it. This is the percent of bachelor's degrees, that's the kind of university degree, awarded in science and engineering, separating the two, comparing two different time periods, 85 and 95, and then comparing it across countries. And what we see is that in engineering, the U.S. actually is kind of on the bottom of the heap, and it's falling. In science, the U.S. is just now, as of 1995, on the bottom of this list, and it's falling. Whereas we see many other countries are ramping up the proportion of their talent pool that is technically and scientifically trained. How are we going to boost the rate of innovative output in the U.S. if we don't have the manpower, the person power, that can deliver the next generation of science and technology? You know, basically what happened in the U.S. was that our innovation system in the U.S. was fundamentally grounded in the Cold War. We used the political support of the fight against the Russians and communism as the political motivation to fund our R&D enterprise. Much of it took place through the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense parceled out scholarships for people to study engineering. I got a National Defense Foundation fellowship for my engineering training 20 years ago. We had a whole enterprise that was predicated on the Cold War. But when the Cold War, quote, ended, the political will started dissipating. And indeed, in our country, we have a situation now where many Americans believe that science and technology is somehow threatening, and it's somehow a problem. There are great fears about high-tech medicine driving up the cost of healthcare, even though high-tech medicine is the only way to control the cost of healthcare. There are fears about genomics and biotechnology, and fears about, you know, the kind of next generation of scientific breakthroughs. And that's reducing the political support as well as a tight budget environment for the kind of investments we made in the past. But why do you think the U.S. is so good in the internet? Well, because 25 years ago, we started investing. And there was a systematic, sustained campaign. And that's why the internet happened. And that's why geosynchronous satellites happened. And that's why advanced materials happened. And a lot of the other things that are flourishing in the U.S., they were the result of fundamental investments that we made in the past that increasingly we're not making today. What's the story for France? I think the story for France is really not nearly so striking. We have, I think, however, there's certainly room for reflection and improvement. We find that really the concern in France is really with the aggressiveness of the R&D budget, the R&D spending rate. France's rate of R&D spending has really not been increasing in step with the other advanced nations. And the kind of science and technology personnel in the workforce is really not really improving. It's kind of staying still. I think, as with the United States, France needs to recognize, I think, more vividly that in the future, this is going to determine the standard of living of the French citizens. How good we are at this. And the same thing is true for Americans. And we have to find a way to build a political and public consensus around this agenda to kind of take the next, for the next 15 or 20 years. Well, there's so much more I can say, but rather than take all of the time broadcasting, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be delighted to have some dialogue and answer some questions about this research or frankly, anything else anybody's interested in. Thank you very much. Good, thank you.
Professor Michael Porter, thank you very much, and welcome to our faculty as Professor Honoris Causa. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Please visit us at www.hec.edu.